Hi, everyone. Welcome to the fourth CM talk series for fall 2022. Today we have our speaker, Gladys Kamau, who's going to give the talk, and I'll be the chair for today's meeting. So Gladys Kamau is going to talk about combining cluster abundancy and reclassing to derive cosmological parameters. Gladys is currently working with Professor Heidu Wu from the physics department, and she is a PhD computing student who is about to defend her comprehensive exam. So Gladys, I think you can talk the rest by yourself. Good luck with the presentation.
Thank you, Brian. Yes, so today I'll be taking you through how to combine cluster abundance and weak lensing to derive cosmological parameters. So over the years, the understanding of the components of our universe has been changing based on the new discoveries that astronomers and scientists continue to make. So the current dominant model explaining the component of our universe and how our universe came to be is the Big Bang theory. So it explains that our universe started as a big explosion. Initially, it was just a small dot that was very condensed and hot, and then it exploded. And with the explosion, it just started expanding and expanding and expanding. So the Big Bang theory generally can be classified into three main categories. That is the radiation phase, and then we have the matter phase, and then the dark energy phase, where we are dominated by dark energy. So during the radiation phase, that's when the initial explosion happened, and the cooling started. And then when the matter-dominated phase is when stars and galaxies started forming while the universe was still expanding. And of recent, in the 20th century, when the discovery of the dark energy was made, they realized that the universe is actually expanding at a faster rate. So the discovery of dark matter, which initially they believed that the dark matter was forming the larger percentage of the component of the universe, was made from starting 1933, around there, when they believed that the mass within a star is not enough to hold the objects orbiting in the star, So in that case, I mean, like objects orbiting in a star, if the mass is less, that is from the matter that we are observing, it cannot be able to hold objects as you move from the center of the star. So the objects will be like escaping away from the orbit. But what they observed is that even as you move away from the star, the objects orbiting in the star, they're still being held together, and they're even rotating faster than it is expected. So this was more discoveries that were made from the year 1993 to the around 1970s. And in the 1980s, the astronomers were convinced that there is something that we are not able to see. It doesn't emit light, it doesn't interact with the normal matter, but it is strong, it is reacting. We can be able to see it through gravitational influence that it is having on the luminous matter, or the matter that we are able to see, that is the ordinary matter. But later in the 20th century, another discovery was made. Initially, the scientists, when they observed the universe, they could see that from observing the distance and the light coming from the supernova, they could see that the universe was actually contracting based on the matter that is in the universe. So it was expanding, but at a slower rate. But in the late 20th century, they rather observed that the light coming from the supernova is rather far away from us, or the distance has increased much than it is expected if the universe was actually expanding at a slower rate. So they concluded that there's actually some form of energy that they don't understand. That's why they call it dark energy, that is actually causing the universe to accelerate at a faster rate. So in that, the dark matter, which was rather discovered before the dark energy, the component reduced and realized that the dark energy is more than the dark matter, but the two components that were recently discovered are still mysterious. That is enforcing more research to understand what is really happening and what they are made of, because nothing much is known. Nothing much is known about it besides the dark matter. The gravitational force that we can see, the dark gravitational force that acts on the ordinary matter, and the dark energy, which is believed to be causing the fast acceleration of the universe. So in this discussion, we'll be looking at some of the observables that astronomers observe when they're using the telescope, when they're surveying the universe to try and understand the content and the distribution of dark matter and dark energy. So the synthesis looked at 4 papers. That is a dark energy survey, year 1 results, which is an observatory. It is based on observatory data. So the main idea behind the paper was to derive 2 cosmological parameters, that is dark matter density and the density fluctuation. The other paper was also based on observatory data, and the main goal of the paper was to model the weak lensing systematics and fit the weak lensing mass to constrain mass richness relation. The rest of the 2 papers were based on simulation, which are looking at some of the systematics that affect the observations that we make and when you're trying to estimate the mass of a cluster. So they were purely based on simulation, and they only focused on one systematic effect that is going to be predominant in future, which we'll look at later. So the dark energy survey is a survey that was conducted, that I mean by a telescope was placed to observe the sky from the year 2013 to 2019. And it was able to capture several images which are converted to tabular data, which is what we'll analyze to try and derive the cosmological parameters. So the image you're seeing shows a deep sky observation of galaxies. That is just one of the images that the Dark Energy Survey telescope was able to capture. And you can be able to see the different colors in the end of the galaxies. You see the red and the blue. The red it means they're very far away from us and they are more fainter compared to the ones that are brighter and bluer and closer to us. So after the Dark Energy Survey, which captures just the images of the universe, the data is later converted using models and algorithms to tabular data, which we can be able to analyze easily. So some of the data products that was used in this synthesis was in the papers was a photometric catalog and the photometric redshift catalog. So by redshift, in the catalog, they estimated the redshift and the distance. By estimating the redshift, you can be able to estimate the distance of the cosmological objects, how far they are from us. So how it is done, the telescope is fitted with some filter bands, and the filter bands is able to selectively let light based on the wavelength based on the wavelength to pass through. So based on this sensitivity, we're able to capture the spectrum of different galaxies, and we do this optically, and there's a spectroscopy way of observing the redshift of galaxies. So the spectroscopy, we have the full wavelength of the galaxies captured, and we have the bands as well. So we try to map the wavelength, the full spectrum of a galaxy being mapped on the bands that we use in the Dark Energy Survey to measure the magnitude of the galaxies. So in the graph, it indicates the filter bands that is used in the Dark Energy Survey. We have the green, red, purple, and black. That is the G, R, I, and Z. And then you can see some lines. So the lines indicate the galaxy spectrum, which have a feature that we use to estimate, that they use to estimate the redshift of the galaxies. So for the blue So these lines, based on the colors, the blue, red, and green, those are the different spectrum of galaxies. So the blue one, you can see a sudden dominant drop at the 4,000 break. That is the feature that they use to estimate the redshift of the galaxy. So based on where that feature maps on the filter bands, that is the GRIZ, they are able to estimate the redshift. So this data is used to train a model that they use to predict or to estimate the redshift from the redshift of the data that was observed from the dark energy survey. The reason for this is just it is hard to observe the magnitude of every galaxy. So we use what we obtain from the spectroscopy to estimate the data that is gotten from the dark energy survey. The other two data sets are the shear catalog, which contains the shapes of the galaxies, like the ellipticity. So we have ellipticity 1 and 2 based on the diagonals of the ellipticities. And then we have the cluster catalog being identified using an algorithm. So the algorithm tries to identify clusters, which I mean clusters is a large gravitationally bound object, and the largest we know so far in the universe, that houses galaxies, many galaxies. So we use this algorithm to try and identify the clusters. So it works by clusters generally. The content of the cluster is mainly the red sequence galaxies, the galaxies that are done with stars formation. So the redMaPPer algorithm uses this technique to identify the galaxies from the database, the data that we have generated. So the other function that we'll be needing when we're trying to derive the cosmological parameters is called the halo mass function. So for us to fully understand or to interpret the cosmological parameters that they will be trying to derive, this function will help us to connect the halo mass function and the cosmological observables that we'll be using, that's the cluster abundance and the weak lensing mass. So the halo mass function, this is from a theory. The plot was from a theory analytical model. So it shows that as the dark matter increases, as we increase the value of the dark matter, that is the content of dark matter in our universe, the number of low halo masses and high halo masses increases. But as we increase the level of the value of density fluctuation, we only see an increase of the number of the massive halo masses. The low halo masses generally remain the same. It doesn't increase that much, but we see a higher increase in the number of massive halo masses. So now that we have our data, we've described our data, and we have a function that will help us to connect our data to derive the cosmological parameters, we go ahead to define the two cluster observables that we'll be using to derive our cosmological parameters. So in this case, we have the cluster abundance and the cluster mass. So cluster, after identifying our clusters, it was binned into redshift and richness. Those are the two observables in our cluster catalog. So after the binning, the number of clusters within each bin is what we are calling the cluster abundance. So redshift is basically the stretched wavelength due to the expansion of the universe, and then richness, which was assigned by our redMaPPer catalog, our redMaPPer algorithm. It assigns richness, which is the number of galaxies within a cluster. So that is what we are calling richness. So after, and the other cluster observable that will be helping us is the cluster mass. So we need to estimate the cluster mass. When the telescope is observing the sky, we cannot measure the cluster mass directly. So this is a measure we need to, this is an observable we need to measure from the observables that we have, like the ellipticities, and we'll see how we'll use it to estimate the cluster mass. So in the cluster mass estimation, we use the property called the gravitational lensing. So when you observe a cluster, the gravitational lensing, it occurs when a galaxy acts as a gravitational lens that bends light from distant source galaxies. So in this case, we as the observer here on Earth, we have a cluster that is in between us and the source galaxies that are far away from us. So the source galaxies, the light coming from the source galaxies is bent, it is bent by the cluster that is in between us and the source galaxies. So we use that property to try and estimate the mass of our clusters, which we will be using to derive the cosmological parameters. So given the two properties, the cluster abundance and the cluster mass, it forms the data vector containing two variables that we're calling our observables. So in those two vectors, we try to fit that data, and fitting that data, they come up with a likelihood function, which we'll be trying to maximize. And in maximizing the parameters that we're trying to fit, the parameters that they are using to fit the likelihood function are the parameters that we are trying to derive, that is the cosmological parameters and other parameters. So they use MCMC. Since we don't know the parameters, they use MCMC to generate the parameters that will be maximizing the log likelihood function of fitting our data. So the plot here shows, the blue bar shows, the bars shows the observed data, and then the dots shows the fitted data. So the parameters used to fit the data are the parameters that optimize the log likelihood function. So in the lower panel, it shows the residual between the original data and the data that was fitted. So as I mentioned earlier, the observation of the cluster observables is affected by systematic effects, which affect the cluster mass and the cluster abundance. So and at the end of it all, it also affects the cosmological parameters that they're trying to derive. So we'll be looking at projection effects, the shear and photometric redshift systematics, the cluster abundance, the cluster member dilution, and the cluster miscentering as the sum of the predominant systematic that affect the analysis. So projection effects, it occurs when the optical cluster finder, that is the redMaPPer algorithm, misidentifies clusters along the line of sight as genuine members of the cluster. So this leads to an upscatter of the estimated cluster richness. So when the redMaPPer is trying to identify the clusters along the line of sight, it tries to include galaxy members that don't belong to that particular cluster. And if it includes, it increases the number of the richness, that is the number of clusters belonging to that cluster. And increasing the richness, it means it will also we'll also see an upscatter in the estimated cluster mass. So in this paper, they were trying to understand and try to quantify the impact of the projection effect when you're trying to estimate the cluster mass. So from the two plots, we are seeing the true cluster, that is the true richness. In the true richness, it means it was obtained from a catalog that didn't have the projection effect. And the other richness observed, it's from a catalog that has the projection effects. So from these two plots, when you're combining, the prediction comes from an emulator that was used to predict the weak lensing signal. So in these two, in the true cluster catalog, we can see that there is the true catalog compared to the prediction, that is the dark emulator prediction, there's no boosting of the weak lensing signal, so it aligns well. But when you observe from the observed catalog, we see a boosting in the large scale. The lensing signal is boosted in the large scale. So it means we are observing the projection effects in the weak lensing signal. The other observation, so the first observation was just on the weak lensing, trying to observe if the projection effect affects the weak lensing signal. The other property that the paper was trying to look at was if projection effect is present in the clustering signal. And in this case, you see a similar observation. In the true catalog, there is no projection effect, so the signal is still the same, and the signal from the true catalog and the prediction they are the same. But from when we are comparing with the observed catalog, we are seeing an boosting of the clustering signal, confirming the presence of the projection effects. The other systematics that affect the weak lensing analysis is from the shear and the photometric redshift. As I mentioned earlier, the generation of the photometric redshift catalog is estimated, and all these estimations, they have some systematics associated with it. The fact that we don't know the exact distance of objects in the sky, we are only estimating it. It means we have to give that allowance for the systematics that are involved. And the shear systematics, some of the factors that affect the accuracy of the generation of the shear catalog is like point spread function and the noise bias, such as the blending, that is the overlapping of galaxies. So we see two galaxies as one. This is another systematic that affects, but it is due to the poor resolution. As you're observing the sky, the resolution is not so clear. So you can't be able to tell if the two galaxies are overlapping. The other two systematic effects are cluster member dilution. So the cluster member dilution is where we are considering the foreground galaxies or galaxies within a cluster as member of the cluster. So in this case, we're expecting that the foreground galaxies and the galaxies within a cluster to have zero weak lensing signal. So if we include them when we are computing the weak lensing signal, it is going to dilute the signal that we're expecting. The other one is cluster miscentering. In the cluster miscentering, it refers to when the sky location of the cluster centers gets misidentified. So, and in the misidentification, it means the center of the cluster is not in the correct location. So this one leads to underestimating of the weak lensing signal, and underestimating weak lensing signal leads to underestimation of the cluster mass. So one of the papers that I mentioned previously keenly looks at those systematic effects and tries to model the correction of those systematic effects before estimation of the weak lensing mass. So in one of the papers, it tries to correct the systematic effects and then estimates the weak lensing mass. The estimated weak lensing mass is used in another paper now to derive the cosmological parameter. So it will be forming one of the vectors in the 2D vector that we'll be using to derive the cosmological parameters. So in the paper that uses the cluster abundance and the cluster mass to derive cosmological parameters, and after using the maximizing the log likelihood function and obtaining our parameters using MCMC, the results that the paper finds out is it results in a discrepancy when compared to other studies done by other people. And from these two, we can see the results of the paper. So the dark gray region shows the S8, which is a function of sigma 8 and omega m. That is the density fluctuation in the dark matter density. So we can see it is very low compared to the other analysis done by other people. And this observing the loads because of the dark matter density observed in this paper was very low. And the other one shows the density fluctuation and the omega m plotted. The gray region, which is the results of the DES paper, also it's very low due to the low density matter. So this shows that there's something wrong that either the paper did in the modeling, or there's something wrong from the data that they quite didn't understand. And on digging deep on the problem, why they observed very low, why they got very low cosmological parameters, they realized that when trying to omit clusters with low richness, that is low mass, they observed that the results was the discrepancy was reduced. So it was somehow converging to other results that were done by other people. So, but upon identifying that omitting low richness, they didn't quite have a clear idea of really what is really causing the low richness mass to affect the cosmological parameters observed. And this forms one of the gaps in the paper that enforces more research to be done to really understand the systematic that is really causing or really leading to the observed cosmological parameters to be low, or the discrepancy between the results of the DES and the other paper to really differ. The other gap that was identified is the projection effects, which is dominant and not well understood. So far, there are some studies ongoing, and people are trying to understand the projection effect and trying to quantify it for the future study. So in trying to understand or try to offer more insight on the gaps, what I'm currently working on is trying to quantify the selection bias, which is related to the projection effect. The fact that the redMaPPer is selecting clusters that are along the line of sight and having the projection effect systematic. So the main aim of what I'm currently doing is trying to quantify the optical selection and projection effect in cluster gravitational lensing. I'm using assimilated data, and then I will be trying to compare the richness and of the different max process. So in this case and in this synthesis, what they have been using as a mass proxy is the richness. So in what we're trying to do now, we're trying to evaluate or to try to see other mass proxies if they will be affected the same way as the richness by the projection effect. And then we'll be looking at, the main goal is to offer more insights to what will be coming in future, which is the LSST observatory data. So far I've been able to extract the two cosmological catalogs, and then I've been able to match the two catalogs, that is the halo and the redMaPPer clusters, and I've been able to compute the weak lensing signal from the halos. So this plot shows what I've done so far, and that is obtaining the two cluster catalogs and then computing the weak lensing signal. So the upper panel shows the weak lensing signal from the underlying, both from the underlying and the richness selected. So the green line shows, in this case, I'm plotting two signals. That is the excess surface density and the surface density. So excess surface density is the green one, and then the blue one is the surface density. So we see in the dotted line, we see a boosting of the lensing signal from the two surface densities. And the boosting we're observing, it was computed from the clusters selected using the redMaPPer catalog, the redMaPPer algorithm. And then the solid line represents the lensing signal computed from the underlying halos. And then that is the lower panel shows the ratio of the two respective weak lensing signal. So in future, we're expecting an LSST observatory data. So the survey is expected the survey that is going to collect that data is expected to start in July 2023, and it's going to take, it's going to run for 10 years. So that survey is going to be more deeper, and we're expecting to be affected by the projection effect because of the depth, which we have. If you remember, I mentioned earlier that the projection effect is where we are including galaxy members as part of clusters along the line of sight. So it means if you're going deeper, we'll not be able to tell exactly, we'll have that systematic will be more dominant because we'll not be able to tell which galaxies belong to the clusters. So this is what, and what I'm working on, the Cosmo DC2 data is a simulated data that tries to emulate the LSST observatory data that will be coming in future. So in a way, we're trying to prepare for what is coming for the observatory data. So in conclusion, the derived cosmological parameters from the galaxies using the BES data exhibits discrepancies when compared to other probes. So further probe shows that the derived low omega m is originating from wrong interpretation of the weak lensing signal. This implies there are some systematics that are yet to be captured by the model, and this motivates the need for further observational and simulated analysis. So for what I've been doing is what will be going under the computing artifact, which is on the GitHub repo. Let me share. So the repo contains, I hope you can be able to see my screen. So the repo contains some of the notebooks that I've been working on to compute the weak lensing signal. It has 4 main Jupyter notebooks, and I've explained in the README. And one of the notebooks explain how I extracted the Cosmo DC2 catalogs, and then I saved the catalogs. And then in the as I was extracting, I was also learning another Python open source software that has been developed to try and estimate cluster mass. So I was trying to try and compare the calculation of how the open source developed Python software is working. So, and I also developed a user-defined function to compute the weak lensing signal. So I compared the two, and the cluster, the other function that has been developed is called CLMM, that is cluster weak lensing mass modeling. It was quite slow, and it can be able to compute the weak lensing of a cluster one at a time. So we opted to use the user-defined function, which was faster and easy to also parallelize. Since there are so many classes, there are more than 180,000 classes, which I was required to compute the weak lensing signal. So the 4 notebooks, the first one entails how the extraction of the cluster catalog and computing the weak lensing signal from the 2 methods. And then we have the analysis of the weak lensing signal, which resulted in the plot that I've shown in the slides. And then the third catalog shows the joining of the clusters, the joining of the 2 catalogs, that is the clusters identified using redMaPPer and the underlying clusters catalog. And then the other one shows just the color index of the redMaPPer. So it illustrates the color index, the measurements of the red sequence galaxies. So one of the main requirements for you to run the notebooks, you need to access the NASC, which is computing. It offers the computing resource. So the catalogs are quite huge. It's not just one catalog. There are so many catalogs under the astronomy study. So the catalogs are mirrored in the NASC. not something you can download and have it in your computer. So you need to have access to the NASC, and then they provide the access to Jupyter Notebook, and you can run everything in Jupyter Notebook. So for you to do any analysis on the Cosmo DC2 and the notebooks that are here, you need to have access to the NASC. I've included the links in case you're interested to join, and yeah, and then you can be able to run the notebooks. Thank you. Questions?
Thank you, Kamau. Do we have any questions?
Yeah, I think I have two questions for you, Kamau. I didn't quite understand the part of the redMaPPer's algorithm. Is it embedded in the satellite? And another question is, what does redMaPPer use to identify those clusters you're using, apart from the color index? Is it just the color index or other features does it look for?
I'll start with the second question. So yes, it uses the red sequence, and it also has a threshold on the luminosity of the galaxies to identify the galaxies belonging to a cluster. So mainly it uses, yes, the red sequence to identify the clusters. And then the second question was, the redMaPPer is not embedded in the telescopes. It's an algorithm that was developed later to be used on the tabulated data that has been generated to identify clusters.
Okay, so, and maybe another one which has popped up. So the density doesn't matter. The density of the cluster doesn't matter when the redMaPPer is identifying those clusters.
No, so the clusters are, where the location of the clusters is where the density is very high. They're on the peak densities. And that is where the red sequence galaxies are. So yeah, the density doesn't matter. But when we identify the clusters, we assign the richness to each cluster. So in our analysis, we don't consider richness below 20 because we don't really know if it's really a cluster or just a galaxy.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, just to clarify, redMaPPer does use density. It's not so kind of similar to the machine learning clustering algorithm. It does find high density, but it requires also inside that density, galaxies has to be bright and red. That's the red sequence that Gladys just mentioned.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Kachinga, for the question. Okay, so can I ask about the recessional redshifts?
Sorry?
Can I ask about the recessional redshifts?
The what?
The redshifts, like
Okay.
you are talking about them, how you're using them to do some kind of, is it gravitational sensing, something like that. So can you explain a little bit more?
I don't get your question.
I saw some graphs about redshifts.
Okay.
Yeah, so just asking if you can explain a little bit more.
Do we lose Gladys?
Internet, maybe.
Gladys, you are muted.
Sorry, I left. I'm back. I'm trying to share my screen. You mean here?
Yeah. So I was expecting most of them to be red.
No. So when you observe the galaxy, when you observe the universe, not all galaxies emit red, or not all galaxies emit, not all galaxies are red, and they don't, and the spectrum has a wavelength of different colors. So it depends. So there's blue, there's red, there's so many colors. So what we're interested in is the red shifted galaxies, which tends towards the red part of the spectrum. But we have the blue and the green in between. So the red in this case, it shows the galaxy due to the expansion of the universe. It shows that galaxy is far away from us. So that's the name, the red shifting. And then the green one is a bit much closer to us, and the blue is closer to us, the blue shifted galaxy.
Okay, so those that are far away, so those are, is it the one that will have the recessional velocity?
In a cluster, that is what we expect. Like in a cluster, for the evidence that shows there's dark matter, we're expecting as you move from the center of the cluster towards the outer region, we're expecting the velocity to reduce. But rather we are seeing that the velocity is rather increasing. It means there's more contact, that there's more matter than what we're observing, causing the velocity to increase.
Thank you. Any other question?
Maybe just another one. So this data from the telescope, is it imagery or the data structure of it?
Yes, they are images.
Okay.
Okay, since we have no more questions, thank you, Gladys, for today.
I think I have a question.
Okay, Titus.
Yeah, so when you were talking about the resolution, were you referring to like the resolution of the images taken by the telescopes?
Yeah, in this case, yes.
Okay. So I'm wondering how those, like, can you tell me a bit about how the resolution affects the cluster masses?
The clarity of the images being taken, it's not easy to tell if the image you're observing are two galaxies overlapping or it is just one. Although there are some studies going on to try and separate and be able to try and identify in the images when you're converting the image data to tabular data to try and tell if the two galaxies are overlapping or not.
Okay.
Yeah, I think this question from Titus has raised another question in me. So how do you quantify these errors? How do you quantify this overlapping in your model if two clusters are overlapping?
So the same technique was used, fitting the weak lensing signal that was computed, and then they tried to estimate the parameters using MCMC. So the systematic effects were modeled for the shear, for the photometric, and the other miscentering and the dilution. So they were all modeled as a model as a likelihood, part of a likelihood function model to try and regenerate the data. So running the MCMC, we're able to estimate the parameters that are associated with those models, and then they were corrected when estimating the weak lensing mass.
Okay, thank you.
So if two clusters overlap, do we expect the redshifts of those clusters to be the same? Or because I was thinking if the clusters are overlapping and if they have different redshifts, then we should be able to identify they are not the same cluster.
Yeah, but you know, some galaxies, when they overlap, the redshift might not be that different from each other, and it mainly affects the shape of the galaxy. So the ellipticity that we observe and try to estimate the weak lensing signal is what is going to be affected. It mainly affects the shape, not the redshift.
Okay. Yeah, well, that's okay here.
Thank you very much for coming today, everyone. So I think the final defense will be there in 2 weeks, isn't it, Kamau?
Yeah, it will be on 28th October on Friday morning at 9:30.
In person or Zoom?
Zoom. I will share the link.
Okay. Yeah, I'll be happy to join. Some announcements. Next Wednesday, we'll be hosting Sandra Babare, who should be taking us through her prior defense too. And yeah, be happy to be here, and you're all invited. Otherwise, thanks everyone for coming today.
Thank you.